Today, we are staring down a clear, intentional, and calculated attack on the foundational rights of approximately 6 million residents of Minnesota. Governor Tim Walz, the self-proclaimed Old Elmer Fudd, along with his DFL cohorts, is trying to weaponize tragedy to illegally and unconstitutionally shred the Second Amendment. Their entire political maneuvering around a special session is nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to ram through a list of anti-freedom mandates. This isn't about safety, it's about control. They believe they can bypass the legislative process, ignore the fundamental rights protected by the Second and 14th Amendments, and force through policies that failed even when they held the majority. This effort is an outright violation of the Constitution and a challenge to every law-abiding gun owner in the state. The recent push for this highly restrictive special legislative session gained immediate momentum following a pair of deeply disturbing and horrific incidents. The first was the assassination of former House Speaker Emerita Melissa Hortman and her husband in June 2025. Reports indicate that law enforcement found a target list allegedly created by the shooter that included other Democratic lawmakers and abortion advocates. Weeks later, the state endured the mass shooting at the Annunciation Catholic Church and School in Minneapolis in August 2025. This inexcusable tragedy claimed the lives of two innocent children, 10-year-old Harper Moisky and 8-year-old Fletcher Merkel. While initial reports listed 21 injuries by gunfire, investigators later confirmed the total number of victims hurt that day was 30. Many of whom suffered wounds from bullet fragments that were discovered later. It is an inexcusable reality that those who seek to disarm the populace never let a tragedy go to waste. These incidents immediately became the political justification for DFL leaders to demand action specifically targeting constitutionally protected firearms. Governor Walz previously stated he would call a special session one way or another after the Annunciation shooting, regardless of Republican support. This aggressive narrative quickly shifted to position the DFL as the caucus listening to Minnesotans demanding action, while accusing Republicans of refusing to address gun violence in any real way. This posturing attempts to create a false moral imperative for immediate action, even if that action means violating the constitutional rights of millions. The DFL caucus leader, Representative Zach Stevenson, emphasized that his caucus is committed to meaningful action on gun violence, specifically including the removal of weapons of war off our streets. This language is designed purely to demonize commonly owned firearms that are inherently protected by the Second Amendment. They are leveraging the grief of parents, such as Brittany Haig, whose 6-year-old son was seriously injured, and the medical community, like Dr. Tim Kummer, who argued that the children have a right to go to church and not be shot at, to pressure lawmakers into abandoning their oath to the Constitution. The detailed proposal released by Governor Tim Walz and DFL legislative leaders laid out a shockingly specific blueprint aimed directly at violating the fundamental rights of Minnesotans. The highly restricted special session was proposed to begin on Monday, October 6, 2025, at the state capitol in St. Paul. The core policy initiatives they agreed upon, in which the session's activity must be confined to passing, are fundamentally unconstitutional restrictions on the right to keep and bear arms. The top item on their radical agenda is the blanket ban on so-called assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. As we consistently point out, there is no such thing as an assault weapon. Assault is an action, and a firearm is an inanimate object. These proposals target commonly owned semi-automatic rifles and would constitute a direct violation of the Supreme Court's precedent in cases like Heller and Bruen, as well as the Second and 14th Amendments. Furthermore, what they deceitfully label as high-capacity magazines are simply standard capacity magazines that have been legal and widely used for decades. This deceptive terminology is crafted purely for political effect, aiming to eliminate essential defensive tools. Beyond these sweeping bans, The DFL proposal includes other targeted violations, such as a binary trigger ban. They also seek to eliminate the so-called ghost gun loophole, a phrase that suggests an oversight where none exists. This is nothing more than an attempt to criminalize the lawful assembly of personal firearms, something that has been legal and lawful to do since before the founding of this nation. The DFL wants to mandate the serialization of parts, implement stricter rules on do-it-yourself DIY kits, and increase oversight on components that do not currently meet the definition of a firearm established by Congress. Finally, the proposal seeks to strengthen Extreme Risk Protection Orders (ERPOs), widely known as red flag laws, including increased funding for public outreach and education. These are arguably the biggest risk to the Second Amendment. They are unconstitutional workarounds designed to strip citizens of their rights without due process, violating several protections guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. This entire package is a laser focus on violating the Second Amendment, using a highly restrictive special session to force through fundamental restrictions on self-defense rights. The procedural framework proposed by Governor Walz and DFL leaders reveals a cynical, calculated effort to bypass legislative scrutiny, muzzle dissent, and prevent true compromise. This is a clear indicator that they are not interested in good faith governance or robust debate, but rather in jamming their radical agenda into law. The DFL proposed that the special session, if called, must conclude by Sunday, October 12, 2025, with both the House and the Senate adjourning sine die before 12 Showdown on Monday, October 13, 2025. That would have given the legislature a mere 6 days from October 6th to October 12th to finalize, debate, and pass sweeping, unconstitutional legislation that impacts millions of Americans and fundamentally changes the state's constitutional landscape. This aggressive, tight timeline is explicitly designed to force action and limit the ability of patriots to organize opposition. The proposal went further, placing draconian restrictions on the legislative process itself. The agreement stipulated that legislative leaders would not support amendments once the bills were finalized, unless the amendment was unanimously agreed upon by all 4 legislative leaders and the governor. This effectively means they intended to prevent meaningful debate or compromise on the floor. As Republican House Speaker Lisa Demuth rightly pointed out, the DFL's proposed framework would cut out the necessary legislative process. They were demanding that legislators agree to pass bills that hadn't even been fully written or vetted by committees, further demonstrating their intent to confine the special session strictly to their political goals. The agreement specified that no other bills could be passed unless there was a unanimous written agreement among the leaders. The narrow scope ensured the entire exercise was laser-focused on violating the Second Amendment. Even the budget, which was set to an agreed target of $20 million net impact per biennium, was to be negotiated by all 4 legislative leaders and the governor before the session started. They laid out the policies, the timeline, the budget, and the restrictions on debate. The entire structure was ready to ram this constitutional violation through both chambers really fast. This strategy blatantly disregards the role of citizens and their elected representatives, telling the people, who are supposed to be their employers, that their input does not matter. The success of the DFL's unconstitutional plan hinged entirely on their ability to secure a deal, a prospect that quickly dimmed due to the precarious political landscape in St. Paul. The Minnesota legislature is sharply divided, presenting a significant hurdle to any radical gun control measure. The House is currently tied, meaning that moving a bill out of any committee requires at least 1 Republican vote at every step. Meanwhile, the DFL-led Senate is down 1 vote due to a vacancy, making their majority extremely narrow and uncertain even within their own ranks. Governor Tim Walz originally asserted he would call a special session regardless of Republican support, vowing to call it one way or another. However, as negotiations stalled and the constitutional reality set in, Walz abruptly shifted his stance. By Wednesday, he suggested that without a breakthrough, calling lawmakers back to St. Paul would be a waste of money and a waste of time. Walz acknowledged that because of the legislative makeup, Republicans hold veto power over this. He stressed, "I need to get an agreement on this." This pivot reveals the fragility of their position. They cannot afford to look defeated by calling a session that immediately collapses under the weight of the legislative gridlock. Republicans have stood firm against the DFL's demands, particularly the infringement on firearm ownership. House Republican floor leader Harry Niska R. Ramsey stated clearly that he did not think there were any Republican House votes in favor of those kinds of proposals, like an assault weapons ban. Niska even suggested that the governor was just trying to politicize a really horrible tragedy. He highlighted the fact that even when Democrats controlled the trifecta in 2023 and 2024, they lacked the necessary support, and some additional gun rules failed to pass the state Senate. Niska pointed out that Democrats didn't even bother having committee hearings on those bills previously. The Republican response, led by Speaker Lisa DeMuth, has consistently stated that they will show up if Walz calls the session, but they will not agree to pass a gun ban that hasn't been written and detailed. This gridlock demonstrates that constitutional principles cannot simply be steamrolled by political urgency. With negotiations at a clear impasse and the October 6, 2025 start date passing without action, Governor Tim Walz has shifted to public pressure and political theater. Unable to secure the votes for his unconstitutional gun agenda, Walz announced a series of town halls, a calculated effort to maintain visibility and pressure GOP lawmakers until the 2026 regular session. He plans to appear with parents, doctors, and clergy who have urged him to act. Over 750 faith leaders signed a letter demanding a special session and an assault weapons ban, joined by activists staging a 7 days of prayer and action at the Capitol. These emotional appeals are being weaponized to shame Republicans into abandoning their constitutional obligations. Dr. Tim Kummer, an emergency physician, emphasized the severity of rifle injuries, arguing that kids have a right to safety, a message central to the DFL's moral framing. Walz admitted opponents are dragging this out and hoping people will forget, but his response has been amplifying public outrage, not engaging in good faith negotiation. He challenged Republicans, "If you think banning these weapons is a bad idea, vote no." Yet Speaker Lisa DeMuth rightly countered that Republicans will not vote on a bill that hasn't been written. The DFL's process circumvents due process and legislative scrutiny, while experts note that an assault weapons ban would be tied up in court for years. The party's reliance on red flag laws, which undermine the Bill of Rights, shows a preference for political optics over constitutional fidelity. While the DFL remains fixated on banning firearms and undermining the Second Amendment, Republicans have advanced proposals that address the actual causes of violence: mental health, school security, and criminal accountability. Their counteroffer avoids restricting law-abiding citizens and instead centers the special session on school safety, public safety, and mental health. This aligns with polling showing 40% of Minnesotans cite mental health as lawmakers' top priority, compared to 30% who cite guns. House Speaker Lisa DeMuth R. Cold Spring emphasized that the Republican framework preserves the proper legislative process. Bills filed, debated, and vetted by committees, focusing on student safety, expanded mental health access, and public safety improvements. She even proposed adding anti-fraud measures to broaden bipartisan cooperation. Senator Jeff Howe R. Rockville reinforced that meaningful progress requires concrete action, not symbolic restrictions that fail to protect children. The Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus, led by Rob Dorr, echoed this stance, calling an assault weapons ban a non-starter. Dorr urged lawmakers to separate the DFL's toxic package and focus on grants for school security and expanded mental health programs, arguing that identifying people in crisis is far more effective than restricting lawful ownership. The Republican position is clear: fix mental health failures and punish criminals, not infringe constitutional rights. The DFL's insistence on pairing mental health funding with gun bans exposes its true motive: control, not safety. With the DFL's proposed start date of October 6, 2025 now behind us, and no special session having been formally called by Governor Walz, the initial push to ram through these unconstitutional measures has failed, at least for now. The legislative gridlock, defined by a tied House, and the DFL's inability to rally even its own members to support an assault weapons ban proved too formidable a constitutional hurdle. The governor's decision to reverse his previous stance, from vowing to call the session one way or another to labeling it a waste of time without a deal, confirms that the leverage they hoped to create simply evaporated in the face of Republican resolve and procedural reality. The battle, however, is far from over. Legislative leaders, including DFL caucus leader Zach Stevenson, have made it clear they are not giving up on this issue. They intend to continue pushing for these specific measures: the ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines and the strengthening of red flag laws, whether it is through a renewed attempt at a special session during the regular 2026 session that begins in February, or by trying to win a campaign, get a majority, and pass it in 2027. This demonstrates a long-term, resolute commitment by the anti-rights lobby to seize firearms from law-abiding citizens. This entire special session saga serves as a crucial reminder that for citizens, the lesson is clear: we are the employers of our country, and these officials are our employees. Their failure is only a pause, not a victory. Gun owners must stay engaged, contact legislators, oppose every iteration of this agenda, and hold the line on the Second Amendment. No special session, no compromise. The attempt by Governor Walz and DFL legislative leaders to circumvent due process and ram through an unconstitutional gun control agenda has been temporarily derailed by political gridlock and constitutional opposition. Their failure to secure an agreement for a special session focused on banning assault weapons and standard capacity magazines is a small victory for the Second Amendment. However, their commitment to violating the rights of Minnesotans remains absolute. With leaders vowing to continue the fight into the 2026 session, we must stay vigilant, keep the pressure on our representatives, and ensure that the battle, now shifting toward next February, ends with the decisive protection of our fundamental, God-given rights. Stay sharp, stay informed, stay armed, and stay free.